Welcome. I'm Claudia Bester, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Hammer Museum. Together with UCLA history professor Brenda Stevenson and the UCLA Department of African American Studies, we're presenting a series of programs about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the worst episodes of racial domestic terrorism in our country's history. The Tulsa Massacre was a momentous event in America, but it wasn't a standalone incident. It's just one of the most egregious cases where such a range of systemic racism was laid bare. There were so many aspects of society and so many public and governmental components complicit in the violence. It was really a perfect storm comprising the police, the military, the banks, the insurance companies, the newspapers, the schools, the judiciary, the local business leaders, and of course, the racist white mob that murdered and pillaged and burned down an entire community. Sparked by this important 100-year anniversary, we're trying to unpack the history and legacy of racial violence in the United States through 4 online panels covering the history of the massacre, other instances of domestic terrorism against communities of color in the United States, and the economic empowerment of Black Americans. And I want to thank James Fugate and Tom Hamilton, the proprietors of SO1 Books, which was just voted Bookstore of the Year by Publishers Weekly. They've been incredibly helpful with ideas and research for the series, and it's clear that their insight and customer service are why they are the best independent bookstore in America. For tonight's program, we're trying to expose how financial sector and public government programs have been structured for centuries to prevent Black economic development. We want to tease apart these impediments that are hidden in plain sight to expose how systemic racism happens in very tangible ways through unequal legal and financial practices like mortgage lending, small business lending, student lending, farm loans and subsidies, insurance, redlining, land ownership, home ownership, FHA programs, the GI Bill, white flight. All of these practices happening side by side with a continual threat of physical violence against Black people, violence like lynching and property destruction and false prosecutions and imprisonment. And all the while, Black people were not in practice provided legal protections nor political representation through voting rights. That continual threat of violence is at the core of the impediments to Black economic development. It is, in essence, domestic terrorism. So tonight we'll take a deep dive into the continuum of ways that Black economic development has been deliberately inhibited due to 2 main factors: white resentment wherever Black people succeeded economically, and greed where people see the opportunity to turn a profit through racist practices in the financial sector. There's never been a level playing field for Black people to build wealth in this country, and still today the average white household income is 6 times higher than the average Black household income. So if you want to convert that to dollars, that means if the average white family household income in the US is $76,000 a year, which apparently it is, then the average Black household income is $12,600. This is in 2021. We need to put an end to the myriad covert ways that our society has skewed terms in favor of white economic development to prevent anyone seen as other from prospering in America. And in order to end it, we first need to be able to see it, to identify it, talk about it, and then we need to roll up our sleeves and do the work to eradicate it. So that's why I feel tonight's program is so important. It's the first step we can all take in educating ourselves about how systemic racism permeates all areas of civil society and public authorities hidden just below the surface. But yet, as we speak, several states are actually trying to ban any discussion of systemic racism in their public schools, colleges, and universities, partly in response to the publication of the Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project. As of last week, 14 states have introduced some form of gag order legislation with respect to the teaching of racial injustice in American history. Even the governor of Oklahoma, who sat on the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commemoration Committee, voted for one of these gag order bills, which are really no more than organized attacks on truth, history, and equity. So clearly, there's a lot of work to do. And I hope you can all join us next week for our final Tulsa Centennial panel on domestic terrorism against communities of color. And now I'm going to introduce our speakers for this evening. Mehrsa Baradaran is a professor of law at UC Irvine Law School. Previously, she taught at the University of Georgia School of Law, where she was the chair in corporate law and the associate dean for strategic initiatives with a focus on diversity and inclusion efforts. Baradaran writes about banking law, financial inclusion, inequality, and the racial wealth gap. Her scholarship includes the books How the Other Half Banks, and most recently, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, both published by the Harvard University Press. And The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap was awarded the Best Book of the Year by the Urban Affairs Association. Baradaran has also published numerous articles, including Jim Crow Credit in the Irvine Law Review, Regulation by Hypothetical in the Vanderbilt Law Review, It's Time for Postal Banking in the Harvard Law Review Forum, Banking and the Social Contract in the Notre Dame Law Review, and How the Poor Got Cut Out of Banking in the Emory Law Journal. And Baradaran has advised US senators and congresspeople on policy, testified before the US Congress, and spoken at national and international forums like the US Treasury and the World Bank. Dr. Gerald Jaynes is professor in the Department of Economics and the Department of African American Studies at Yale University. In addition to his teaching and research at Yale, he's served in many public capacities. From 1985 to 1989, he worked with the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C., where he was the study director for the Committee on the Status of Black Americans. He also served as the chairman of the New Haven, Connecticut Minority Business Development Agency and the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Committee for the Redevelopment of New Haven. He's a fellow at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies and a member of the Council of Economic Advisors to the National Urban League. He's testified before the United States Congress on numerous occasions and served as a consultant to federal and local government agencies. He's recognized as an expert on the economic conditions of African Americans, and his research has been cited internationally within legislative bodies and courts, including the United States Supreme Court. Among his more notable publications are A Common Destiny, Blacks and American Society, Branches Without Roots, Genesis of the Black Working Class in the American South, and Immigration and Race, New Challenges for American Democracy. Our moderator this evening is Dr. Brenda Stevenson, who, as I mentioned, has been my collaborator in putting together this series of programs. Dr. Stevenson is an internationally recognized scholar of race, slavery, gender, family, and racial conflict. She's a professor of history and African American studies at UCLA, where she's the Nickel Family Endowed Chair. And she's on her way to England, where she will be the inaugural Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women's History at Oxford University. Her most significant books include Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots, and What is Slavery? She was also the senior editor of the Encyclopedia of Black Women's History, and she's just now completing a book on the Black enslaved family. So now I'm very pleased to turn the discussion over to Professors Brenda Stevenson, Gerald Jaynes, and Mehrsa Baradaran. Welcome.
Well, hello, and thank you all for joining me today as part of our series that we're having, commemorating and remembering and thinking about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Well, for those of you who are just turning in and just beginning to think about Tulsa, let me tell you that at the time in 1921, it was considered the most deadly and the most destructive of quote unquote race riots at the time. Just to set the background for you, Tulsa, Oklahoma was the location of one of the most interesting and also one of the most wealthy of Black communities in America at the time. In the area called Greenwood, there were many businesses, about 300 to 400 businesses. It was a place where there were professional offices, there were churches, there were small shops, there were also larger businesses, there were grocery stores, restaurants, etc., schools as well, and high schools in particular, which is important because many African Americans did not have access to high schools at the time. Tulsa had been, or this section of Tulsa had been developing since 1905. And it was something that was heralded by leaders of the day, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, etc. This was a place that had its own newspaper, a Black newspaper. It was a place where the Black wealth was significant and it was obvious. And so on May 30th of 1921, a young man by the name of Dick Rowland goes into the Drexel business store. He takes the elevator, or he gets into an elevator where there is a young woman by the name of Sarah Page, who is the elevator operator. Something happens in the elevator. He bumps into her, or he touches her by accident, and she screams and runs out, and he runs out because he's afraid as well. Well, by the time that it gets in the newspaper and through the grapevine, etc., it's been that he has attempted to rape her. And in the attempt, as a result of that, he is arrested and he's taken to the local courthouse. At the same time that this is happening, and the news of his attempted assault of this young woman spreads through the town, both the African-American community, which is very much concerned that he might be lynched, because people often were lynched for these kinds of accusations, began to gather and try to figure out what to do. And also in the white community, people were gathering, were talking about it, and had made up their mind that indeed they would use extralegal justice in this case, and that they would attempt to get him from the courthouse and indeed lynch him. And so groups of men, both Black and white, both armed, went into downtown, went into close to the courthouse. And you can imagine what happened. As the white policemen tried to disarm the Black men who had assembled, one of the guns went off, and then there was a huge, melee of gunfire. After that, it seemed to be a time for the white community, or members of the white community, to take out all of their racial angst, particularly with regard to the destruction of this wealthy section that was Black owned and operated. And they set upon Greenwood, burning at least 30 square blocks of it, destroying the business center, destroying churches, homes, businesses, offices, restaurants, etc., and killing willy-nilly at least 300 people. African Americans were killed. Many were ran out of the town and never returned again. Some of them were able to rebuild, and that's another part of the story. But I'm going to stop with what happened there on the day of May 31st up to June 1st, 1921. And in this part of our discussion of Tulsa, we're going to really be looking at Black wealth. And we're going to not only look at the way in which it's accumulated, but the way in which it has been targeted. And targeted not only by individuals, but by institutions. Targeted not only by local towns, but also in the federal government. And so I'm very pleased to have these two wonderful scholars with me today as we talk about it. Now, I am a scholar of slavery primarily, so I'll begin by just saying that, of course, we all know that Black people were really unable to accumulate wealth during the era of slavery. While about 10% of African Americans were, quote unquote, free at the time of general emancipation in 1865, few of those persons had been able to accumulate wealth, primarily because they had been discriminated upon. They were not allowed, many people were not allowed to have education, and certainly not higher education. And also, many people were not allowed to practice certain professions. Many people were not allowed to own any property, including, land. And most African Americans were agricultural workers at the time. Many people were not allowed to live in urban areas, particularly in the Midwest and the West. Many people who gained their freedom were exiled from their places of birth once they gained their freedom. And so there was very small only a small amount of wealth in the free Black community at the time. And most of that was not located in the American South, where, the large majority of African Americans were enslaved during the antebellum period. So these people are coming out of slavery with very little wealth. They're coming out with very little education, only about, again, 10% of literacy rate among African Americans at the time. And they come into the era of Reconstruction. And I'm going to just ask Jerry to talk a little bit about Reconstruction, because I know your first book deals with that to a certain extent, and talk about what was the economic landscape for African Americans during the era of Reconstruction, primarily in the Deep South, or in the American South, where most African Americans were located.
Yes, and that's quite important, because if we think about Black wealth and wealth accumulation, since Brenda, you began with slavery, I'll just start out with an interesting fact from some data that has been put together by some scholars very recently. This isn't even published work, but in 1860, if you looked at the average Black household's wealth and compared it to the average white household's wealth, as you would expect, it'd be very different. So the white-Black wealth ratio at the average is just not quite 60-1 on the eve of the Civil War. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that out, and that's obviously not surprising, since for nearly all the 4 million African Americans were enslaved, that by the end of Reconstruction, that 60-1 ratio had fallen to 20-1. So it dropped by 2/3. And how? Well, you also had mentioned, most African Americans were still living in the Deep South and border states, and they were mostly at this point, I'm talking now roughly around 1880, 1880 to 1890, they were primarily engaged in agriculture. Now, for most of the audience, if you've heard anything about African Americans in agriculture from the end of the Civil War till roughly World War II, the typical story that we hear is about sharecropping and how African Americans were taken advantage of, and everyone was dirt poor and cheated, and it was a kind of almost slavery. Well, in some sense, that's true. That is, that if we look at the majority of African Americans in agriculture, they were sharecroppers, which meant that they worked for a plantation owner, oftentimes former slave owners, because they still own the land, and they were given a small farm, 20 to 40 acres, with their family. They worked it, and they were able to receive about half the value of the cotton that was produced. Now, as I said, most were poor. But the story we don't hear is that all the Blacks in agriculture weren't poor. So there were, in any county in the South that you might go to, whether it's in the Black Belt, meaning counties that have the richest soil, the largest plantations, and Black population percentages from roughly 75 to 90-some%, to counties where the whites might have the majority, you're still going to find Black landowners. So there are virtually tens of thousands of Black landowners, say in 1900, all across the southern states. And the reason why we get that decrease from a 60-1 white-Black wealth ratio to only 20-1. I shouldn't say only, because obviously 20-1 is still very high, but it is a dramatic reduction, which kind of shows the progress that African Americans, and in particular African American farmers, were making during this Reconstruction period before the violence set in and things began to change. So it's primarily due to land holding, and holding of other kinds of things like mules, horses, plows, and implements. So African Americans, if the violence, which begins during the Reconstruction period, of course, Ku Klux Klan, and then which we're discussing this week with respect to the Tulsa race riot, if that violence, which is put into effect to check African Americans at various points over the last century or so, had not occurred, we'd be in a much stronger position. And probably that huge reduction from a ratio of 60-to-1 to 20-to-1 during that first 20 to 30 years of freedom for most of the Black population would have been indicative of what might be happening even today.
Well, that's certainly true, I believe. And also we have, of course, during this time period, many people leaving the Deep South and starting to spread out along the Mississippi River, people establishing all Black towns, both in the South and the Midwest, et cetera, in a place like Oklahoma, where Tulsa occurs. But we do begin to have disfranchisement during this time period. We began to have night riders, the KKK, race massacres are occurring during this time in the South. If we look at Memphis, for example, if we look at places in Louisiana, we look at Mississippi, Meridian, Mississippi, et cetera. And oftentimes, it seems as if these race massacres, Rosewood, Florida, et cetera, are targeting people who have acquired wealth. And so I'm going to switch over now to talk to Mehrsa and to find out what you can add to this discussion about the targeting of wealth, particularly at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, setting the context really for us for Tulsa and what happens in Tulsa.
Yeah, so I think in the review of the history and the law that I looked at in my book, what is very clear is that it's impossible to accrue wealth if the legal system isn't going to protect your property. And the first case is obviously there was property in man and women, right? So slavery is a commodification of Black bodies. And then in the Reconstruction era, that sort of goes away. But the transition to capitalism is thwarted. As he just said, there was a brief moment of Reconstruction. And afterwards, what you have is, sharecropping is one aspect of it. So there's that diminished wealth, but there's also this lack of political representation and disenfranchisement. And then add to that political violence. So it's not just Tulsa, it is the random and threatening violence, terrorism that is inflicted on Black property owners. It is the refusal of legislatures to validate Black IP rights, Black contract rights, and property rights. And then to the extent that successful Black communities are formed, and Tulsa is not the only one, there are several, and Black businesses and Black homeownership is able to be accrued, then there's randomized acts of violence. And it's not obviously coordinated, but it was very much a means of sending a message to other Black businesses and Black property holders. And that message was received. I looked at a lot of the accounts during that time and for a long time where Black businessmen and bankers and homeowners were very aware of these threats out there. And so they would protect themselves in various ways. So Tulsa is the example of what happens when you build a beautiful church in the center of town and there's plenty of money. And of course, there was like a resentment building before that particular incident. But Durham was another example of a very successful Black Wall Street, one of the most successful. And the Black businessmen and banks of Durham made an explicit decision to make their buildings smaller and not to build that church in the middle of town. And it was very clear that they were doing so just kind of live and let live, they said, right? Durham also did not have that downturn that Tulsa experienced. Durham, because of a different kind of economic structure, it was both tobacco, but also textiles, was able to maintain somewhat equal measures. And so there wasn't that resentment building like what had built in Tulsa. But, I think the racial terrorism of the era continued right into housing segregation. So I've studied several, Black bankers, Black real estate brokers whose homes kept getting bombed over and over again. And this is up in the North, as you're familiar. And the bombing, yes, it's random. It's not organized. It's these mobs, these racial mobs that form, many in Chicago, many in Newark and Detroit. I mean, there was no such thing as a race riot that was not white led until the late 60s, right? Every race riot in American history up until when they started calling them race riots was white led. And I think the point is that this was it wasn't just about the wealth that was taken in Tulsa by the burning. It was about the wealth that was inhibited because of the message sent to other entrepreneurs and other owners, and the fact that the legal structure was not going to protect you. The town did not investigate. Nobody went to prison. There was no legal redress, no damages paid. There was a complete crisis. The refugees were sent around the country, and then they came back and were essentially given the message that you don't bring it up, you don't talk about it, you silence things like that. You can go do the same thing in Wilmington, Delaware, Forsyth County, Georgia. There was an Atlanta riot, Chicago. So and then the individual acts of lynching and property theft that were never punished by the law. So I think you start to see a complete picture of how attempts at progress and ownership and wealth were thwarted because of these racial resentments. And of course, it goes back to these theories of racial hierarchy and supremacy. Right. If you are getting out competed by a race that you conceive of as being inferior, then that is going to build resentment. And that's part of how racism leads to this violence. You don't have to tell the mob to go burn it down. White supremacy will do that itself.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And racial etiquette is so important. And if you look at what happens in North Carolina, for example, versus what happens in Tulsa, people would have said, oh, well, you can't act as if you are better than white people. You cannot demonstrate that you have more wealth than white people, or that you're better organized, or, you aspire to a higher class than white people. And so, that is certainly part of the slapback that Black people who were able to acquire wealth and status, et cetera, experienced throughout the nation, not just in Tulsa. And I do recall so much my parents who were from the South talking about, if you had a nice pair of mules or something, people would poison them. If you had a good crop, people would come in and burn down your tobacco barn. All these things happen. And my grandfather was one of the property owners, was one of the successful farmers, as were his brothers in South Carolina at the time. But you had to tread that line of submission and less than very, very carefully in order to succeed. So I want to turn to Jerry again and ask you, in the time period of Reconstruction, because we do have the military there. I mean, that's one of the big differences between the post-Reconstruction era, is that you don't have the military there in order to enforce contracts, in order to, protect people's property, et cetera. Do you or Mehrsa want to give our audience some examples? I know, Mehrsa, you have a lot of them in your book about Chicago, for example, and Black banks, et cetera. But Jerry, do you have one also about maybe a farming entity and how, people were able to still thrive, really, given that, people were watching them all the time, and that there were random acts of violence? Because one of the things that's so frightening is the random act of violence. It is that somebody could just show up in the middle of the night and burn down your house. And you didn't know what happened. It just happened. You always knew it could happen. So, so how were people able to get around that?
Well, they had to tread very carefully, as you indicated in your earlier comments. So, for example, I know that there were lots of cases where Black landholders who were very successful would do things like have 2 different bank accounts in 2 different towns, so that nobody could see how much money they actually had. Someone, say later on, when people were starting to buy automobiles, wouldn't buy an automobile even though they wanted one and could afford it, simply because they knew that that would attract undue attention from envious whites who would probably do something. Or they might buy an automobile that is in worse condition than they thought. They would not dress as nicely as they might. But we're thinking about this at the high level. If we simply think about this, if we go back now to the sharecroppers, if you're thinking in terms of a lot of desolation entered the minds of many of the African-American farmers, simply because they understood that if they were to progress too rapidly or to progress at all, as one Black farmer in a narrative that I've read put it, that the white people in the area would sooner or later come and, as you said, possibly burn down the barn or burn the crops or put up some trumped up charge where they would say you stole something, cart you off to jail or something along those ends. Now, the last thing I'd like to say about this is because in my profession, economics, is just somewhat shameful that in our discussions of economic advancement, wealth accumulation, business entrepreneurship, where we should be the people doing most of that, right? We leave out violence. Right? If you pick up anything any economist has written, with the exception of a few, there's not going to be any mention of violence, or maybe there's going to be 1 or 2 sentences about violence, but then there's going to be some analysis that's supposed to be rigorous, which looks at things like lending and Blacks didn't have this, or they were illiterate, or they didn't get loans because they weren't good enough farmers, or those kinds of things. When in fact, if you think about it from a psychological perspective, and thinking about how regular, ordinary people are going to be operating their lives, not super talented or exceptional people, but regular, ordinary people, which after all, though that's the reason why the Black to white wealth rate today is 6-to-1, right? It's because if you look at the average white household, their wealth is 6 times the average Black. But these are just regular people. They're not exceptional people. And so if you're a sharecropper, renter, or if you're in town trying to get a job and you're shut out, South Carolina, North Carolina, both of those regions that Brenda was just talking about, where textiles were extremely important. Blacks couldn't get jobs in that industry, which is the major employer of white people in the southern states from roughly 1920 or so to 1970. They hired no Black men or women, with the exception of a small number in every plant of Black men who might be working outside, loading bales of cotton to come into the factory, or loading sheets of textiles to go out of the factory, or they might be inside sweeping. That's the only kinds of jobs they could get in the major manufacturing sector of the South. And anytime anyone attempted to bring Black workers in, as was attempted by one of the largest textile firms in the South, in the Fulton Bag Company, right outside Atlanta, Georgia, attempted to bring a small number of Black women into the folding department of the mill in the late right around 1900, and immediately all the white women in that department walked out. They were immediately followed by all the white men who worked there, and some violence broke out. And finally, after saying he wouldn't give in, the mill owner surrendered.
Mm-hmm.
So violence is probably the number one factor in Black disadvantage in all sectors of life. And we don't talk about it enough. We have these special occasions where we talk about violence, but we should be talking about it whenever any of these issues come up.
Mehrsa, I want you to talk about Black banking during this time period. You know, thank you, Jerry. And you're absolutely correct. We do not talk about violence. And you're right. Every sector of Black life is impacted by it, and generation after generation after generation until we get to today. And we can see what the violence is also hampering and impeding Black life and development. But Mehrsa, I know you spend a lot of time talking about Black banks and how Black banking has supported the accumulation of Black wealth, but also how Black banking also has been hindered in society. So can you tell our audience a little bit about that related to Tulsa, if you will, and moving forward from that time period into a more contemporary society?
Yeah, I do want. I want to follow up on the violence point that Jerry or Gerald just made. In that, it is one of the things that makes Tulsa distinct, and some of the violent cases up in Chicago, like with Dr. Ocean Sweet or Jesse Binga and others who had violence done upon them, is that the NAACP believed in the Second Amendment rights of Tulsans to protect themselves. And part of the way that the law works, and this, Max Weber's, you talked about economists, neoclassically or classical economists like Max Weber understood that violence was very much integral to an economy. A state has a monopoly of violence, and if you're not going to enforce that monopoly of violence, you don't have a national economy. So Black communities were outside of the protection of this monopoly of violence. And to the extent that they tried to protect themselves through through constitutional rights, they were punished. And so I think that is an important point in the legal structure. So going to Black banks, it's very much the same theory. A little bit sort of more abstract in that if you are not involved, if you are not included, I should say, in the commerce of the nation, in the banking sector, in the tracks, if you think of banking as payments and credit, which are like railroad tracks that goes, sends money around and sends credit around, and you're saying to the Black population, okay, these are these tracks, you can't come on these. You have to make your own tracks. And you do it without the capital, without the protection of the law, and without any inclusion into this sector, which it really wasn't until, I would say, today. Then you have the Black banks sort of struggling to create wealth. Banks can't, out of whole cloth, create an economy out of capital that doesn't exist. That's not what banks do. Banks are a reflection, they're engines in the economy. They can't change the factors in it. So they can't change capital and labor. And so banks have, and to the credit of the Black economists who have studied this over the years, Abram Harris in 1936 wrote, the Negro's Capitalist, I think is the book called, and it was looking at Black-owned banks and what they can and can't do. And then Andrew Brimmer, who was the first Black Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and also, looked at the Black banking sector and says, look, the way that the economy works is you need inclusion. If you're not going to integrate people, that's fine, but you have to integrate the economy. You can't have these exclusions and segregation and still have capital building in this sector. So I think that the Black banks and the economists who studied this understood what was going on. And the problem, I think, and that I try to highlight in the book, is the policy of white dominated institutions who offset the responsibility of justice and redress onto Black communities. And now I'm talking post sort of civil rights era, where we say, okay, well, the answer to a legacy of the racial wealth gap is for Black banks to be built and a segregated economy to sort of build itself up by its bootstraps. And we're not going to provide the bootstraps, you're just going to do it. And so what I try to do there is to follow, and I didn't intend actually to write just about Black-owned banks. I intended to write about follow along my research, which is about the idea of community banking and whether that works, when you have a public banking system. And I wanted to use immigrant banks and Black-owned banks as a case study to say, look at these institutions. If you exclude these people, they can't. These communities, whatever the immigrant community or the Black community were. This is a case in point about what I'm trying to say. But as I started digging down into it, I realized that this was just this massive can of worms that really, I think, showed a bigger point. I mean, I still think the point that I was trying to make, hopefully, is a thread in the book. But the bigger point is you actually have a purposeful segregation that is very profitable, in fact, to the white homeowners. And it wasn't sort of this myth that was accidentally created. It was very cynical. It was very coercive. And so that's the book. The book ended up being much more angry as I discovered some of the histories and the logics of what was going on, especially the Nixon era. That was really eye-opening for me.
Well, you're absolutely correct that it is sinister, and it's also something that's systemic, as you have indicated, and Jerry has indicated too. If we move back just a little bit to the period post-World War II, and we're looking at the insurance companies, and we're looking at the housing programs, and we're looking at trying to hold on to segregation within our society in terms of residences and things like that. Jerry, can you talk a little bit about, how the federal government continues to support the building of white wealth, but also continues to diminish the ability of Black people to build wealth out of these programs that are coming out after the Great Depression, for example, and also certainly after World War II?
Well, there would be three major sources of the federal government building, essentially giving a fulcrum to the building of white wealth and discriminating in effect against people of color and African Americans in particular. And the first, of course, would be the, as Brenda, well, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is fueling dollars to farmers starting really during the 1930s, but continuing to the present day, and is giving loans to farmers, which is which allows Southern farmers in particular to get credit and buy tractors, which replace mules. But once you replace mules and horses, you're replacing the men and women who are behind those mules and horses. So part of the impetus of the second component of the Great Migration, the one that is occurring in World War II and after, is a depopulation of the rural South, where they're being pushed off the land by landowners who no longer need them because of those federal government programs. The second program would be the housing. That was slightly touched upon a few minutes ago, but the Federal Housing Authority and other parts of the banking sector that are getting aid and changed regulations and laws from the federal government, which allow them to operate and loosen up credit for home buying among Americans. Federal Housing Authority regulations openly discriminate against Blacks, other people of color, Jews, and certain foreigners, or immigrant populations. So, and they would use words like, you are not to make loans in certain neighborhoods to groups that might destabilize the neighborhood. Well, that was code for, obviously, the groups that I just named. So during this flood of borrowing and lending, which is occurring because of the opening up of credit that the federal government was allowing to or helping to happen during the immediate post-World War II era, and by immediate, let's say the first 15 years, roughly 1945 to 60, all of this big housing boom occurs. And hundreds of thousands of white Americans with regular jobs are able to buy houses, but Blacks and other people of color can't get those loans. The third would be the opening up, of course, which goes in concert with the housing boom, the opening up of the interstate highways and the boom of suburbia, which allows all of these individuals, primarily whites in the first stage of suburbanization, to move out of cities and to allow the cities to, in effect, I shouldn't say to allow, one of the consequences of that is that the city areas collapse because property values obviously fall when the wealthier higher income people are leaving, and no one's doing anything to try to salvage the system. Why? Because the people that are getting left behind are Black.
And thank you. And Mehrsa, during this time period, some of the programs that are being developed by the government include, what comes to be known as affirmative action, the campaign against poverty, all those kinds of things that are happening in the 60s, going into the 70s. Did that make an impact? Did that make an impact on Black wealth accumulation? And how much of it, if indeed it did?
Let me back up to what Gerald was saying about the FHA and the GI.
Yes,
you have a massive restructuring of the American economy during the New Deal. So forget everything that happened before, forget enslavement, forget sharecropping, Jim Crow. Let's just pretend none of that happened. Of course it did. But what you have, just starting with the FHA and the GI Bill, is a complete risk mapping, as he said. And you can go online and look at the exact maps. It's on mapping inequality. And look at the neighborhoods and the way that they categorize risk. This is before FICO scores, before you're doing loan to value ratios, any sort of sophisticated risk scoring. And they just went around and looked at the neighborhood and they said, well, there's Black people that live here. There's subversive races. It's racially inharmonious, which means it's not all white. And then they said, okay, what's green, you can lend. If it's red, you can't lend. And every Black neighborhood, and by Black neighborhood, I mean more than 5% of people in that neighborhood were Black, or there was a Black neighborhood next to it, adjacent. And those were risky and not to be lent to, which meant from 1934 until 1970, 99%, this is a several $1 trillion mortgage market backed by government credit, and not to mention the GI Bill loans, were not lent to Black communities. So Black banks, there were 5 at the time because they weren't getting, other banks are printing money, but the Black banks during this time have to do personal finance, right? So you have to, if you're not getting that FHA guarantee, how do you lend on a mortgage? Well, the way that Americans got mortgages before 1934 is that the bank took on that risk. There was no guarantee. There was no government money. And so you had to find money and then keep that mortgage on your books, which was difficult. And you created 2 different economies. I've called it in one paper, Jim Crow credit, where you have real, it's not just the mortgages, it's the installment loans versus the revolving credit. It's where are payday lenders, how much interest are Black communities paying versus white communities, and how much more are they paying for housing in rent than people are paying in mortgages out in, white Levittown. Levittown, you're paying $35 a month for a mortgage. your equity is increasing, you've got schools and parks and the roads are benefiting you. And then in the city where the red line communities, you're paying $50 on rent for a crowded place with exposure to violence. Let's not forget that this is all, about the traumas of, there's over policing. We're going to add on to that. Right. And then the roads are running through your neighborhood. We're going to put the bus depot down there because that's where we don't want the pollutants up in the suburbs, right? So we're going to zone industrial stuff into those neighborhoods as well. So the environmental impact. Right. And then you have the civil rights movement. So let's look at both, you Black nationalists and separatists and Martin Luther King's, SNCC and the other movement both understood that, look, all the civil rights law, voting rights law, all those laws do is essentially revisit the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and try to say, okay, we're serious this time. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was no new rights given in those monumental acts. I mean, the march, all that happened, the only progress was the same thing that was already inscribed in the Constitution that was paid for in blood by Black soldiers and white, Union soldiers in 1865. And then on the dawn of that, there's a massive white backlash. So by 1966, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP says you could not pass the Emancipation Proclamation in the Congress of 1966. So heated was this backlash. And so then, you've got, you all know about the 60s. I was not present, but, having studied this history, look, you have, Johnson leaves office and you have the race, Robert Kennedy, you all know what happens there. It's Humphrey versus Nixon, and Nixon's entire agenda is to stop any forward motion on civil rights. So we're just talking about, the movement has halted on both ends of the, Johnson has done nothing. Martin Luther King is, killed. Malcolm X is killed. The whole movement just stops, and Nixon comes in, opposing integration, opposing reparations, which was a very live issue at the time, and puts in instead Black capitalism. And this is where, it is a decoy, of course, of the claims for justice. So the civil rights movement was saying, okay, well, just, we want remedies and, a redress for historic wrongs. And the Black separatists were saying, fine, we don't need integration, just pay us reparations. This is like a colonial struggle because we're a colony within a nation. And that was very much the analogy. And Nixon says, okay, Black power, fine, Black capitalism. And that's where affirmative action comes from. Nobody was pushing affirmative action as a number one agenda. It was not a demand of any of the movements for justice. The demands were much more fundamental. You have to erase these red lines. You have to equalize the system of unequal credit. And as soon as that ask is made, then it's, okay, Black banks, we're going to put some deposits there. We're going to put quotas. And then, of course, 10 years later, even affirmative action is reverse discrimination. And you have a complete revision of King's call for, anti-racism, which he called, the one line of content of character gets abused and misused as we're going to be colorblind, and like as Chief Justice Roberts says, the way to stop discriminating on race is to stop discriminating on race, meaning we don't see race anymore. We're not going to do historic wrongs. And Thurgood Marshall is, one of his last dissents on the court is just saying, like, there's no way that the Constitution is going to be a block to righting these historic wrongs. I mean, the Constitution was violated for hundreds of years. And before that, was even more so. And now you're saying that there's nothing that the state can do that benefits the Black population. So you can't get justice that way. And essentially that's what we have. So no, I don't think affirmative action has remedied the racial wealth gap. That was not its intent. Nixon did not intend to close the racial wealth gap. Nixon intended to use the rhetorical spin of Black capitalism to halt progress. And by the way, Black capitalism was combined with law and order, increased policing, the criminalization of generations of Black men and their imprisonment. And so no, that was not the purpose.
Right. And so when Kennedy starts talking about affirmative action in 1960, you know, it really is just to open the door a little bit to Black exceptionalism, really. For Black exceptionalism. And so affirmative action has impact in terms of, you know, education, Black people being able to go to college and go to, you know, and to have funding for colleges and things like that. And affirmative action was used for government contracts, and affirmative action was used for, you know, hiring in various offices that are funded by the government, et cetera. So it did create a larger middle class, I imagine. But I'm gonna turn to Jerry to talk a little bit about that.
Well, it certainly played some role in creating a larger middle class on two elements, and the education front with respect to government jobs first, because the private sector was still viciously discriminating against all people of color, and particularly Blacks, all the way up until, and by viciously, I mean viciously and almost openly, until fairly recently. And then also through the business set-asides and diversification of local government contracting. So those played important roles, and that probably has played some role in reducing the Black-white wealth gap, but obviously not a tremendous amount, because that gap hasn't fallen very much over the last 30 years or so. But when people say affirmative action, yes, we usually think of employment, which is where it was focused for the most part during the 60s and 70s. And then education, higher education, and we know we still have cases going on as we speak. And that gets back to that notion of the backlash. So affirmative action, and you'll note, you know, people don't use those two words, that phrase much anymore, because it's carrying way too much baggage with respect to those backlashes. And I think that, you know, if you look at most surveys, large proportions of white Americans think of affirmative action as unwarranted, undeserved handouts for Black people to get things. So I would just say one last thing about that, and that would be on two fronts. With respect to diversification for business owners. So Nixon did bring in the idea of Black capitalism, and when Nixon did it, he wasn't being all that sincere. That was, in fact, an attempt to split the Black population, because, as you said, he had his Southern strategy, which was to attack Black civil rights and stop it in its tracks, as was said a few minutes ago. But then, so as not to appear to be racist, he offered something to those African Americans who were most well off, and that would be Black capitalism, because the poorest, least educated people aren't going to be the ones who are going to be able to go to the Small Business Administration and get some kind of guarantee to go out and get a loan and start a business. But beyond what perhaps Nixon would have thought could happen, that has now grown and morphed into a pretty wide scale set of policies across the country. So almost anywhere you go, you will find that cities will have some kind of program attempting, that's why I want to use the word affirmative action. Mm-hmm. They will have some kind of a program attempting to redress the centuries of discrimination against Black businessmen and businesswomen that have been going on by those very cities in their contracting. Mm-hmm. Now, over the last 20 years or so, private large corporations have really gotten on board with doing the same kind of thing. So supplier diversity is a big thing among Fortune 500 companies and smaller companies as well. And what that essentially means is that they're trying to diversify the kinds of people who own the smaller firms usually that are selling them goods and services. Because as we all know, they weren't doing that at all in the past.
Well, thank you. One of the most controversial, we're coming to the end of our hour. It went so fast, I didn't realize that we were, but one of the things that people have been talking about in relationship to backlash, in relationship to, failed programs in the past, in relationship to systemic racism and, undermining of Black wealth accumulation, et cetera, the question of reparations comes up. And I'm not just talking about reparations. Often people think about it as writing a check to someone or something like that. But reparations in all of its glory, I suppose, and its many iterations and the ways in which people have talked about it. Is reparations a way of also addressing the systemic assault on a historic assault on Black wealth accumulation? Is this a discussion that we should be having on the national and global level? And where would that leave us in terms of, do you think, with regard to Black wealth accumulation? So Mehrsa, could you talk a little bit about it? I think you were the one who used the word reparations. And so could you talk a little bit about that?
There's no other way. There's no other way to achieve justice without damages. I call it whatever you want. In contracts we do when there is a violation, there's a breach of contract, there is a failure to protect property, there is any sort of wealth extraction, we have several theories of justice. You can, do expectation damages, reliance damages, unjust enrichment, all of those factors when used, in relation to the Black community and its claims against, let's just say, the US government, forget, the other corporations, all of those theories require damages. It is done in other places. It was done in Germany, then it was done in South Africa. It's done with the Japanese internment camps. It is a theory of not just money. It is about truth and reconciliation. It is about measuring, accounting for, and remedying historic wrongs, which we have never done. We didn't do it during Reconstruction. We could have. The 40 acres was very much about, it wasn't a giveaway. This was earned land, if anything.
It certainly was.
And it was also a way of punishing, if that could even be called that, but to diminishing the power of the treasonous Confederates who had fought against the Union, right? The things that were on the table were, what is the punishment for treason? It's death.
Yeah, right.
Or do we diminish their power? And there was very much a desire for reconciliation. And it was, as I show in the book, very much driven by cotton prices and the cotton empire that was not just in the South, it was in the North, and in the merchants of Liverpool needed low cotton prices. And in order to secure low cotton prices to make that whole machine run, you can't have what happened in Haiti. What happened in Haiti is if you give land, people grow crops for themselves. The price of sugar went up because there was less of it, supply and demand. And the sugar markets were, disrupted. Look at oil. We need commodity prices to stay stable, and this was very much about that. And so there wasn't a truth and reconciliation. There was no reparations made then. And then in the 1960s, there was more demands, real sort of, the Kerner Commission report, look at these historic wrongs and just account for them. No reparations then. I think we are at a third pivotal moment where we can't, after a Donald Trump presidency, we can no longer abide by this colorblind myth that racism doesn't exist and we're beyond that. Of course we're not.
Right.
We're not. And so we have to account for it, because otherwise these myths and these stories that are false and destructive linger. You're seeing a resurgence of, IQ science and this BS of pseudoscientific skull measurements that's coming back. Why is that stuff coming back, even though it's been debunked for 100 years? Well,
really,
because
of the last century, right? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, there's not, IQ isn't even a science, let alone race. Is that, and
Race
so,
is not a
but
thing.
it's coming back because people don't get an accurate view of their history. They make stuff up to explain the present differences. And I think actually, the way that Germany dealt with the Nazis is a really good example of a way to excise that. And obviously it's not fully done.
Right. No, it's still happening a little, but they have worked on it magnificently in relationship to ways in which we have worked on, dealing with people who were part of the Confederacy. And it's not just, in terms of treason, but it's also that the wealth and power that they acquired through Black labor that, that was never paid for, too, in terms of the 40 acres and the mule of whatever they were going to give at the end of the Civil War. So Jerry, I'm going to give you the last word on looking at the discussion about reparations, but also moving forward and the acquisition of Black wealth, how we can actually move forward on that front and not let the, I guess, the differences expand, but shrink. What can be done for that? Well,
I think that first, what we can say is it's somewhat obvious that some form of wealth transfer that would come about through reparations would diminish or shrink the race wealth gap. One, two. Importantly, how that's done so that it would be sustained, would have to occur. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Secondly, there's something else that I wanted to get into this conversation, which I think is really important. And it's something that I've only kind of just discovered myself because it's in a book that I've been working on. And it has to do with wealth accumulation and business. Mm-hmm. And Brenda, I think you mentioned the insurance companies in North Carolina. And if you open up any book on the history of Black entrepreneurship, the gold standard are the insurance companies that came out of, for the most part, North Carolina, but then they Wilmington, and they spread to other cities. But in fact, if you went back to say 1955, this is a nice little anecdote. In 1955, the book of the state of Michigan tells us that the largest in terms of revenue and probably profit Black-owned business in the state of Michigan was, in fact, an insurance company. Mm-hmm. And obviously, they're selling life insurance, other kinds of insurance to African Americans. But the interesting thing about that is one of the co-founders of that insurance company in the 1920s was John Roxborough, who, among other things, was the manager of Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion out of Detroit. Roxborough was from Detroit, but Roxborough made his money in what I'll call lottery banking. And we've probably heard of the numbers and policy, and but it gets a very horrible image because where we see about it are those Hollywood movies where they show us the 1930s in Harlem, the gangsters come in and there's this fight out. Well, lottery banking was not like that prior to the 30s and then after the 30s either, for that matter. And the largest, wealthiest Black businesses, the Black businesses that employed the most African Americans, were these lottery banks. We don't know about it, and it was thousands of men and women working in them and running them who were just ordinary people who, if there hadn't been Black racism, would have been running regular businesses or working for regular businesses as accountants, bookkeepers, cashiers, sales personnel, etc. All those kinds of jobs existed in this lottery industry. And we don't hear about it because of discriminatory laws and police prosecution. Okay. So we all know, all these over 20 states have legalized lottery now. And most of those are built on the practices that were first invented by these African-American entrepreneurs in places like Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, Kansas City, Indianapolis, smaller towns as well, Boston, obviously New York, all across the country. That's why it's just literally thousands of employees, but they aren't written about because it was illegal. But it was illegal in the same kind of sense that buying a beer was made illegal for a small period of time in the United States because of the so-called progressive movement, that small minority of white Protestant, Anglo-Protestants, middle-class so-called progressives who passed laws like that also passed these anti-gambling laws. And that's a story that needs to be told.
So we're talking about Black businesses and Black entrepreneurship, and Mehrsa has told us beautifully about, the kind of impact that the government has had on holding the line on that and actually pushing the line back in many, many places. If we were to, Mehrsa, I'm going to ask you just one last question, which is, if we were to write a memo to President Biden and say, these are 5 things that you need to get done during your administration to address this historic and systemic problem of undermining of Black wealth accumulation, what would be, very quickly, what would be those 5? I'm putting you, I know you can do it. So, but.
Well, I did that memo. I was on the Biden transition.
Well, there you go. Well, absolutely. Let's end with your memo.
With Lisa Cook. And, I think really it's about measuring it and doing a cross-agency review of what hasn't been done and what can be done. I mean, the way that the racial wealth gap was created through the New Deal was it was a business of the entire government, every sector, every agency. And that's who needs to have responsibility now. It's not some one act of legislation that's going to fix it. It's, how has any particular sector, whether it's lending, student lending, mortgage lending, any government program that has created these segregation effects needs to be revised and remedied. And so that's across the board. And then to make sure that every institution that was part of this is also devising a way out, right? So I do believe in a sort of, you can't sort of tell people exactly how to fix it, but the industries themselves, like banks are better aware of their own, Black-owned banks especially, and Black-owned insurance companies are better aware of the issues that they face than is, some government agency. And so bringing those groups to the table to really devise a plan is really important. So I think maybe this is an evasive point, but I think the idea is that it has to be cross-cutting, it has to be holistic. It can't just be one approach that is going to. I mean, we haven't talked about the farm loan programs, the credit programs, all in the progressive era that were very exclusionary. So.
Yes, well, so we're talking about Tulsa and the race massacre of 1921, but our point tonight was actually to speak about how this was part of a large continuum of assault on Black wealth and Black accomplishment. And so I'm just really thrilled to have Jaynes and Mehrsa with us this evening to talk to our audience about, what needs to happen and to give further evidence and testimony to what has happened and why we do see this wealth gap that exists in our country between white people and Black people and other people as well. So I want to thank you all very, very much for being with me, and I learned so much from both of you all, and now I have a lot more to learn. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.